We don't want black people in St. Bernard. We don't want public housing.
The map unequivocally showed that the water stopped right where the black people lived.
I applied for 60 GS-14 positions, and I was turned down for every position I applied for.
They were taking me out of my classes. They were following me to my classes. They were like watching me go to the bathroom.
There is no question that recruiting was targeted at the minority community.
In 1999, John Relman left the Washington Lawyers Committee to start a litigation firm capable of challenging entrenched discrimination. Starting with just 3 lawyers, Relman and Associates sought to combine a social justice mission with private sector resources to create a one-stop shop for civil rights enforcement. Today, the firm has more than 20 lawyers with groundbreaking civil rights cases in federal courts across the country. Hello, I'm Wade Henderson. We are gathered on the firm's 20th anniversary, and at a time of peril to our hard-won rights. The stories you are about to see remind us how far we have come and how far we have yet to go. I hope this film will remind us all to remain vigilant and to redouble our efforts to protect those laws against erosion.
This country is based on a set of principles, equality, dignity, that every person should be treated fairly before the law. But those principles are not self-executing. They require lawyers who are willing to do the hard work over many years in many places to ensure that those principles are reflected in our real lived experience. And civil rights firms like Relman, Dane, and Colfax are central to that project of making the promise of America a reality.
They had a large case that they did during the Obama administration against a suburban county in New York, and they were able to demonstrate in this case that the county had received a lot of money certifying that they were following guidelines when actually they hadn't. If they know that somebody's going to watch them, it encourages them to actually do what the law requires.
They have taken on some of the most difficult, entrenched civil rights struggles, ultimately to provide really broad, sweeping remedies for real people in real communities around the country.
Many of the firm's cases have been brought under the 1968 Fair Housing Act, whose principal sponsor is still emphasizing its importance.
The Fair Housing Act has unfinished business. The Fair Housing Act commanded that federal funds not be used to create or maintain residential segregation.
Opportunity is shaped by geography. It is now possible to predict educational attainment, household wealth, and health outcomes based largely on one's zip code. That was clear to the African-American residents of the Coal Run neighborhood near Zanesville, Ohio, whose requests for access to public water were repeatedly denied for nearly 50 years.
On Coal Run, where we was born and raised, we wasn't blessed with a good water.
That's why they called it Coal Run, because on both sides was coal mines. Once the mines closed up, the acid water would seep out of the mines, and it would go into the rock, and then you try to drill, and the water would be just pure acid water. Just to drink it tastes like rotten eggs.
As I cleaned out cisterns and pulled out bugs and frogs and mice and other creatures that crawls around, and I started looking at it, I said, my God, this is worse than the third world country's situation.
Local officials provided public water to virtually every other neighborhood in the region, but refused to provide water to residents of Coal Run. the only African American community.
I'm not a mile and a half away from the biggest water source in Muskingum County. And there's a water line in front of my house. And my neighbors, where the people was white, they had city water just next door.
A guy come there and built a new house, and here they let him hook up to it. He was a white fella. Made you think that they was looking down on you because you didn't have no city water.
Coal Run residents had to collect rainwater or have water trucked in and stored in cisterns. Even then, they were deprived of the usual comforts of home.
We had to watch how much we used. We could only allow the kids and stuff to take showers or baths every other day or two.
In 2003, Coal Run residents asked the Relman firm to sue to make things right. An Ohio jury returned a verdict in favor of the plaintiffs on all claims, awarding a total of $10.8 million for being denied water for so long. The case reminded municipalities all over the country of their obligations to treat their residents fairly with respect to government services. Most importantly, water began to flow to the houses in Coal Run.
It felt so good that you could go in and use the shower. It just felt like you was in heaven.
They say it's the little things in life that makes a person happy, but that's probably one of my happiest moments in my life, was making sure this area had water.
As New Orleans struggled to rebuild after Hurricane Katrina, just beyond the city's lower Ninth Ward, St. Bernard Parish went to extraordinary lengths to do so in a way that maintained its demographics. At nearly 90% white, the parish's policies were hostile to people of color. The parish council adopted an ordinance decreeing that property owners could rent their homes only to blood relatives.
St. Bernard Parish was overwhelmingly white, and Orleans was 67% African American. So there was this concern that they were purposely being kept out because they were African American.
On behalf of the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, the firm got an injunction against the ordinance. The parish council responded by prohibiting the development of multifamily housing, a move again aimed at maintaining existing racial demographics. The firm agreed to represent Provident Realty Advisors, whose attempts to build affordable housing were being blocked by the parish's campaign of massive resistance.
I received an email from a St. Bernard Parish resident. The subject line of the email read, "Nobody has guts." And then the body of the email read, "Well, I do. We don't want black people in St. Bernard."
While I was attempting to speak, there was someone in the crowd who said behind me, "Go back to your ghetto."
After multiple evidentiary hearings, contempt citations, fines, and appeals, the parish finally issued building and occupancy permits. Through persistence and commitment to affordable housing, all 4 complexes were completed in 2012 and fully occupied by a diverse group of tenants.
Where you live is an extension of your personality. So you want to be able to choose, to the degree you can afford it, the place you want to live. And you don't want to be turned away because of somebody's bigotry or prejudice.
Cities receiving federal funding are required to provide a minimum of highly accessible units for people with disabilities. Los Angeles' failure to comply with federal accessibility standards forced thousands of people with disabilities to live in nursing homes, homeless shelters, and even on the street. Disability and fair housing groups spent years trying to get city officials to address the accessible housing crisis, but they would not.
Drive down LA and you see thousands of buildings and apartments, but how many of those are accessible? Skid Row is part of downtown Los Angeles, and there you have the homelessness district. 17% of LA County's 46,000 homeless are people with physical disabilities. There definitely is a crisis.
Cal Life and its allies sought help from Relman, Dane, and Colfax.
There are thousands of units that should have been made accessible, but were not. Developers were given the money, and it was a total violation of federal regulation. So it is incumbent upon us as advocates to really watch what our government is doing. We had to fight in the strongest way possible. And the strongest way possible is a lawsuit.
A city that holds itself out to be a world-class city, but yet treats people with disabilities as second-class citizens simply because there's not enough affordable and accessible housing. People are failed to realize that there are 61.4 million people with disabilities.
A landmark settlement was ultimately reached in 2016, which obliges the city to spend at least $200 million and provide 4,000 highly accessible units to people who really need them. This result made clear to cities all over the country that affordable housing programs must be fully accessible to people with disabilities.
The settlement in Los Angeles, that was an eye-opener for many people in the disability community, to know that we can take affirmative litigation steps and be successful in trying to get settlements to make accessible housing affordable a reality here.
Persistence is one of the touchstones of the civil rights struggle. The willingness to fight on in the face of formidable opponents and complicated legal issues. For more than 17 years, Relman, Dane, and Colfax represented a class of more than 100 U.S. Secret Service agents who had, on account of race, been repeatedly passed over for supervisory jobs and sometimes forced to train the white agents promoted in their place.
I bid over 180 times trying to get that position, and I was denied all those times.
A supervisor told me, you are not going to get promoted. And I'm not saying that you don't deserve it. It's the service is not ready for a black female supervisor.
I built the counter-assault team program. And now you're telling me, well, I can't be a team leader on the counter-assault team, especially since I'd already been one.
After years of intense litigation, the Secret Service agreed to a settlement that substantially changes its promotion system and provides $24 million in monetary relief.
It's another piece that's been added on to history and the struggle for civil rights here in America. We got really what we wanted, some things in place where other younger African Americans and other people of color that are coming behind us will not have to endure the things that we endured.
I'm optimistic about the changes that the Secret Service has agreed to undergo. And so as I close out this chapter in my life, it just makes me happy that I've been a part of a life-changing experience.
Advancing the cause requires substantial legal creativity to find ways to use existing laws to both dismantle new forms of discrimination and address new civil rights challenges. For instance, Relman, Dane, and Colfax pioneered litigation against banks and trade schools for reverse redlining, that is, targeting minority communities with high cost or defective products with little value and high risk. When school administrators in Kenosha, Wisconsin, refused to recognize Ash Whitaker as a transgender young man and prohibited his use of boys' restrooms, Ash sought the firm's help in enforcing the prohibitions against sex discrimination under Title IX and the Equal Protection Clause.
I never wanted it to get to the point of a court case, but that's just where it ended up going, and I think that's where it needed to go based on the reaction of the administration. There was things of taking me out of classes and lecturing me. There was taking down the time of which I went into the bathroom and went out.
Within weeks, the district court entered an injunction prohibiting discrimination by school officials. After the district appealed the decision, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit issued a groundbreaking decision, affirming that discrimination against transgender students violates federal law. On the day of his graduation, the Washington Post editorial board congratulated him on persevering.
I've met a bunch of people who have taken action because of this case. It sets a precedent, and I have since recognized that precedent is incredibly important when it comes to defending someone's rights.
The Whitaker case is without a doubt the single most important federal appellate decision addressing the rights of transgender students. You have no idea what it means for LGBT people and the LGBT community across the country to be getting support and advocacy and representation from a firm with the reputation and the experience and the track record of success of Relman.
The non-discrimination principles embodied in our seminal civil rights laws have the power to shape industries even without litigation. Relman, Dane, and Colfax has, since its inception, worked with progressive companies that want to embrace civil rights best practices, working with financial institutions, employers, online platforms, and local governments to ensure their policies and practices embody non-discrimination and fairness.
I've had the privilege, again, of dealing with a lot of leaders in corporate America on civil rights issues, and I truly do believe that there are many out there who understand that their most precious asset is their reputation. And when you can do things preventively, when you can lead, when you can demonstrate that the high road is the smart road, that's how you succeed.
Airbnb hired Relman, Dane, and Colfax when we were evaluating our non-discrimination policies and seeking to innovate in this area. The mission of Airbnb is to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere, and you can't do that if people feel like they are subject to discrimination. Our partnership with Relman, Dane, and Colfax has been integral to making sure that we are staying on the leading edge of interventions to prevent this kind of activity in corporate America.
Litigation is one tool, but the work that they can do to actually advise companies on some of the most emerging new threats to civil rights on social media platforms, on digital platforms, helping these companies understand the importance of civil rights compliance, making sure that they're hewing to the standards that people lived and died for.
As federal courts become much more conservative, the civil rights movement has many challenges ahead.
The silver lining of this very dark period is the engagement of citizens across this country, lawyers and non-lawyers, who have stood up in response to the election of Donald Trump, in response to the kinds of policies that he has put in place, and said, we are not going to accept this. We're going to fight back.
In late 2017, when the Trump administration proposed to roll back an important program allowing families with rental vouchers to move to better neighborhoods, the firm won an injunction and stopped the administration in its tracks.
We have to remember that even conservative judges, conservative justices, they do care about inequality and discrimination. It's just they often don't see it. So our job is to come up with new ways, more persuasive ways, more credible ways that help these more conservative courts that we are going to be facing in the future understand, really see what our clients are facing.
This is precisely the moment when we need lawyers of this caliber. And so rather than this being a time of discouragement, this is our time. This is the time when we're supposed to do and are doing in many ways our best work.
We know even more clearly than in 1968 that integration is the clearest path for non-white families to acquire a foothold in American education and economic system. That's the dream, and we know it works.
As Relman, Dane, and Colfax enters a new decade, its aspirations remain simple: to continue to expand the scope of civil rights protections, to dismantle discrimination and segregation, and to inspire other advocates to press for higher opportunities for all our sisters and brothers.